Is there a legitimate, credible religious view on the problem of evil? The religious seem to think so, but they're kind of Looney Tunes if you ask me. It doesn't take long to see that, but what happens when you get an actual sort of academic involved? Does this become a higher-minded discussion, or is it still, but I just want to be happy? Well, I don't know. Stick around and see for yourself. We're going to start off a series of videos by Josh Rasmussen on the problem of evil, and I can already tell that this is not going to go well for him. These are people who have no grasp on reality whatsoever, they just really want to believe. And that's kind of a problem, wouldn't you say? It's one thing to talk about this like it's an idea. It's another to think that any of this is actually true in reality. And two guesses which side of the line the religious happen to fall on. I don't think you'll need the second guess, so let's get started.
Can a perfect being sustain an imperfect world?
You're missing a lot in that. Yes, I know I'm hitting him in the first couple of seconds, but the religious tend to just assume a lot of things that are simply not there in evidence. First, they assume that there is a perfect being, or even that there can be a perfect being, and I don't think that's even an option. Certainly, we don't have any evidence of anything defensible as perfect, thus this is rather a pointless question to begin with. It would be fine if you could define your terms rationally up front, but the religious never do that, do they? So I guess all we can do is see where this goes.
In this series, we have searched for an explanation of existence. I have suggested that the best explanation will be in terms of a self-existent foundation, which has no arbitrary, unexplained limits.
Except you just arbitrarily made all of that up because it happens to be emotionally comforting for you and the other people like you. It's something that they don't like us pointing out, of course, because it entirely invalidates everything that they believe, but that is the actual state of affairs that we're faced with. They start off with, well, wouldn't it be nice if... and then they proceed as if that's actually the case. Now, I've said this before, but they consistently confuse if with because. There's really no way to get from if to because without a whole lot of work in the middle, and they don't know how to show their work. This is just something that they really want to believe, and wanting to believe doesn't mean a damn thing.
We could describe this foundation as complete, maximally simple, and perfect. This theory, however, couldn't provide the best explanation if it contradicts other things we know. Do we know anything that would call into question the existence of a supreme and ultimate explanation of existence?
Your explanation? Yeah, plenty. Your explanation is completely unsupported by anything remotely demonstrable. I know you really want to believe it's there, but that doesn't mean that it is. You have to provide corroboratory evidence, and you people have completely failed to do so. Now, I'm sure that will never come up in this video. It doesn't come up in any religious videos after all, because at best, they will just gish-gallop their way to, therefore God! But that's not evidence. That's a claim. That's blind faith. It isn't demonstrable or defensible to anybody who doesn't already believe it as true. But then again, they're not concerned with us at all, are they? They're just trying to comfort the already religiously gullible. They're just trying to say, see, we were right all along. This is not how rational people work. But then again, these are not rational people.
It may seem we do. Consider that problems plague our world. If the foundation is perfect, why isn't everything perfect all the time?
Who says anything is ever perfect? When did we intellectually reach that conclusion? Or is that just a matter of wishful thinking and religious confirmation bias? Because this is exactly where we have all of the problems with the religious. They just assume that they're right without ever taking the time to demonstrate that they're right, because they don't actually care if they're right or not. They just want to believe. And that doesn't make it so. This discussion has to start about 10 steps before they come in, and they've got absolutely no interest in that whatsoever. That's why things never, ever go well for them once the skeptics get involved. And that's why they don't want to talk to us in the first place, because we don't take their faith seriously. We don't care what you want to be true. We only care what you can demonstrate is true, and you people have absolutely nothing. And no apologist anywhere can actually handle that. And that's kind of sad, isn't it?
This video will introduce a short series about this classic problem of imperfection and evil. My goal is not to definitively solve the problem. Rather, I will offer tools that may assist you in your own analysis. In your hand, you can do more with these tools than I can do in these videos.
I'm going to predict right here and right now that he'll do absolutely nothing at all useful. He will, as theists always do, just assume that his beliefs are true and then run around with the goalposts until he gets to a place that is reasonably religiously comforting for himself and his followers. That's really all any of this is ever about, right? They aren't concerned about getting to truth. If they were, they wouldn't start with the presumption of a God. They'd have to work to get there, providing evidence and reason as their guide, but that doesn't matter to them, does it? It's starting with a conclusion reached for entirely emotional reasons, and then backfilling in bald rationalizations meant to get them there with a minimum of muss and fuss. So I don't think this is going to go well, but then again, I don't think Josh is talking to us, is he? Because none of them ever do.
The first tool is conceptual analysis. We can analyze the concept of perfection by asking this basic question: what does perfection logically entail?
Concepts that cannot be demonstrated to exist in the real world are completely pointless, Josh. It doesn't matter what you can make up in your head. If it can't be achieved or found in reality, then what's the point? Because it's one more thing that the religious do all the time. They will arbitrarily assign characteristics to their imaginary friends such that their God delusions become something that is not and cannot be real. Well, let's discuss all of the omni properties that we just made up for our own God to have. Yeah, okay, why? Because they're not demonstrably real. There's no point to it. You're just wasting everybody's time. Then, having wished really, really hard for these things, they will just staple them onto their nonsensical father figure in the sky and confidently declare, well, this is what God is like. Yeah, but you can't prove any of it. How in the hell do you know that? You don't just get to make something up and pretend that it means anything. That, again, is not how rational people operate, but, well, you know.
In previous videos, I argued that there is a concept of absolute perfection that entails great-making features, like power, knowledge, goodness, and necessary existence.
Now, granted, we haven't taken a look at his previous videos, I will admit that up front, but this is why arguing conceptually doesn't really get you anywhere useful. Concepts are not reality, yet he's going to take those farcical concepts and then try to make them reality by just stapling them onto his made-up deity idea. Alright, what have you actually done? I mean, credibly. Because none of this is actually getting them anywhere useful, and that's why he's not talking to us, because we just point out all of the places that he's going intellectually wrong. No, he's talking to the already religiously delusional who just gobble up this nonsense uncritically because it makes them feel good. And I'm sorry, but feeling good is not a credible way to get to the truth. So, you might want to try again.
But does the perfection of a being also logically entail the perfection of the world? To help us think about this question, suppose a perfect being didn't create anything. Would anything of value be missing?
See? This is really where they leave the realm of reality and go into religious la la land. He's now not remotely talking about the real world, just the garbage that he's made up in his head and is assuming to be true for all intents and purposes. So he's proposed a perfect being that can't be demonstrated to be there, who created the world even though there's no evidentiary support for that at all, and now he's just running with the idea as though it actually means anything to anybody with a brain in their head. This is why these apologetic videos are so utterly pointless. When has he ever demonstrated any of this? Never. Not once. No, it's just a fanciful take that he's telling himself in his head, and he's lost complete track of the script when he starts to assume that that's how it really is. Because that's religion for you. It's downright insane.
Conceptual analysis helps to reveal some relevant distinctions. First, a world is not a being. Therefore, a maximally great world is not identical to a maximally great being.
You know, that thing you haven't demonstrated is real at all? Because this goes right back to Anselm's ontological argument and the response at the time of a maximally great island. Just because you can come up with the concept of a maximally great island in your head, that doesn't mean it exists in reality, any more than just inventing a maximally great being means that it's demonstrably real. But the religious, they really don't care, do they? It's why Josh is talking about concepts, not evidence. He doesn't care about evidence. He only cares about the crazy ideas in his brain. Now that might be fine if he could just stick to one side or the other, because yeah, you can come up with ideas and write fanciful stories about them, and hey, that's actually fine. You can sit there and talk about Darth Vader as a concept. You can talk about Harry Potter as a concept. It's when you stop thinking about them as concepts and start thinking that they're real that you run into some serious trouble. Josh, I figure, he's never going to recognize the distinction, because that won't make him happy, will it?
Second, maximal value is not the same as all value. A perfect being would have maximal value, as much value as a being could have. But it does not thereby follow that a perfect being contains all possible value of all possible worlds.
And by this point, he's so far out in the weeds that I don't even think he can see reality from where he is. This is where I think a lot of philosophers run into troubles too. They stop being able to differentiate between the things that they make up in their own heads and the state of actual reality. They run into, well, it could be possible in some world. No, I only care about what's possible in this world, and you people aren't talking about that, are you? Concepts and reality are not the same thing. Just because you can imagine a thing, that doesn't make that thing so. And I was having a discussion recently with somebody, and we were talking about differentiating reality from fantasy, and he kept pulling up examples like all kinds of wackadoo philosophical positions. Well, unless you're fill in the blank with all kinds of utterly indefensible philosophical identities. And I kept stopping him and saying, why in the world would anyone rationally be any of that? Why would you accept zombies? That's not a valid position to take. But yeah, these people, they don't even know what they're talking about anymore. None of it is remotely defensible or demonstrable, and he even agreed with me, but that doesn't stop people from doing it all the time. Because they, like the religious, they don't really seem to care. It strikes a comforting nerve, and therefore, it's just gotta be true, right? And that's just stupid. It really is.
Consider what would be missing if a perfect being were to exist alone. then there would be no variety of beings, no opportunities for exploration, no discoveries, no adventures, no growth or progress, no variety of relationships, where a perfect being could have connection with a variety of beings, including beings with various limits and boundaries. And there would be no you. In fact, one could argue that any being that is unable to create a world with these additional qualities would be limited, and so not perfect.
But you haven't demonstrated that any such being actually exists in the first place, that did create the world, or that it would do any of this. When has any of this ever been established as even remotely reasonable or rational or possible, much less demonstrably true? That's what I want to know, because right now I'm just not seeing it. How is this any different than asking questions about what is the best wizarding school? Well, there are none. They don't actually exist. So what's the point of considering the question? And likewise, what's the point about asking about some magical, maximally great being that has no demonstrable reality? Just because you want it to exist, that doesn't mean that it does. This is religious fanfic. And how stupid is that?
This analysis is just a beginning. Additional questions remain. Is there a best possible situation involving a variety of beings? Or would every state of the world allow for the possibility of additional growth along some positive dimension? Could less than best states be the best means to achieve better states later on? What are these rules that govern what a perfect being should do? And what's their basis?
What the hell difference does that make? So far as we can tell, in actual reality, there are no perfect beings. There was no creator of our reality. That's all just wishful thinking, done for emotional reasons, because these people are too mentally weak to deal with our reality as it seems demonstrably to be. These aren't good questions, because they have absolutely no application in the real world. It's like asking, who is the maximally great Jedi? Who cares? If you want to be a fanboy and wonder that, fine, go ahead, I can't stop you. The second that you start being serious about it, though, that's where you need some serious psychological help. I don't think the religious are immune to that either. It's one thing to wonder who's stronger, the Hulk or Superman. But it's another to actually think that out there somewhere, some big green dude is fighting a guy in a cape. If you cross that line, you got a problem.
These questions, and others you may have in mind, help us analyze the conceptual implications of a perfect foundation. Anyone who pursues these questions carefully and critically can gain deeper insights into the nature of the foundation of things.
No, you can't, because the foundation you're talking about is, as best as we can determine, completely in your head. This is why I'm not remotely impressed with religious wishful thinking, any more than I am with philosophical masturbation. There is no actual application for any of this. It doesn't get you anywhere demonstrably real. If you're not concerned about actual reality and the world that we actually live in, then what the hell is your point? What is your purpose? What the hell are you doing with your life? Those are far more cogent questions to ask, and I figure the religious don't have any better answers for those, but, what's wrong with these people?
I'll conclude this video with an observation about the current state of thinking by philosophers who study this subject in depth. While philosophers have raised many valuable critiques of particular theories of particular great-making attributes such as omniscience or omnipotence, the proposition that a perfect being exists in an imperfect, evolving world is wide open for further analysis.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and completely disagree. I don't think that there has been, or even coherently can be, anything intelligently said about things that aren't actually real. It's one thing if you can learn something about the real by evaluating the unreal in theory, But that's not what's going on here, is it? This is just a bunch of people noodling their navels and letting their emotions run wild. What do you think you're going to accomplish? I mean, what useful things? Because I'm not seeing it, and if anybody wants to explain it down in the comments, that would be great. What have you actually learned? Not made up, not invented in your head, not coddle your own fifis, learned. Keeping in mind that learning, like knowledge, needs to have some demonstrable basis in fact. It isn't possible to learn anything about the current enrollment at Hogwarts because Hogwarts isn't real. You can learn things about the story, but it remains a story. Zero application in reality isn't useful. If you want to treat it like it's entertainment, pure fiction, that's fine, go ahead. But they're not doing that, are they? They think that this is actually real. They think this is actually going on. These people have some serious mental problems.
Incoherence has not been established. To be clear, it doesn't thereby follow that this proposition is problem-free or probably true. I'll address probability in the next video. My observation here is merely that incoherence hasn't been established. Current thinking leaves open a distinct possibility that our world is imperfect while its ultimate source is perfect.
Nope, because you haven't established that at all. Again, not for us, but that doesn't mean we can't criticize it, and we actually should. Because this is where the whole thing is just insane. This is like offering a college class in evil in the wizarding world because of Voldemort, and actually thinking that that's going on. Actually, I'm sure that's probably been done. Our educational system is really messed up these days, but you're not going to impress anybody by just playing make-believe and then taking all of this made-up nonsense seriously. You're just going to make people back away slowly and call for the men in the white coats. And that, once again, is why they're not talking to us, are they? They're only talking to people who already take this lunacy seriously. The people who already need to be put away under psychological evaluation. These people have problems. It's the crazy leading the crazy. These ideas are incoherent because they have absolutely no application in reality. It would be one thing if they wanted to talk about it as a complete exercise in fantasy. That's fine. I've got no problem with that. But that's not what they're doing. They think all of this is real. It's as simple as that. So anyway, let me know your thoughts in the comments. We got 3 more of these videos coming up. Place your bets on just how crazy it's going to get. Why is it that the religious seem to be allergic to understanding the problem of evil? Mostly, I think, because they couldn't actually address it from a theological standpoint if they did. And that's why we just sit here and chuckle as they try desperately to show that their God isn't the complete douche nozzle that he certainly seems to be, because they're not very conversant in reality. It scares the crap out of them to have to live in the real world. So, let's watch another example, shall we? Welcome to part 2 of Josh Rasmussen's look at the problem of evil. It's not going well so far, and it looks like it's going to be getting even worse from here on out. In my experience, the religious don't even know what the problem of evil is. They try to run around with the goalposts and plant them somewhere safe by simply misinterpreting the entire reason why we ask about evil to begin with. Yet he goes completely off the rails here, so badly in fact, that I don't even know where he's going to go in the final 2 videos. Well, I guess we ought to try to get to it, because it's not going away, unfortunately. And this isn't going to go well for him, I can tell.
Is the suffering in our world unlikely if a perfect being exists at the foundation of our world? To help us think about this question, let us consider the most perplexing kinds of suffering. These are bad events such that you see no reason a perfect being could possibly have for allowing them.
And I can see where this is going already. It's not at all uncommon. Lots of theists figure that anything their deity does, no matter how heinous, well, it must be good because their God has a plan. Well, that doesn't stop their God from being a dick, does it? That's really where this becomes such a problem because they are convinced that their God is all good without having any rational way to evaluate their God's supposed actions. Good according to who? Well, according to the religion, of course. The God has to be good because that's what they believe, and they can't be wrong, could they?
Call these events mysterious evils. Now, before I continue, I would like to acknowledge that suffering and tragedies may pose for you heartfelt questions and concerns. My aim here is not to justify evils or to explain them away. Rather, I will offer a tool that can help you in your own analysis of the evidential weight of evil with respect to various worldviews.
And that's where this is going to go wrong, because I don't weigh reality with respect to worldviews. I weigh worldviews based on how closely they are aligned to demonstrable reality. What's happening here, or what's going to happen, I figure, is that he's going to try to defend his view of God that can't be demonstrated to be real at all. It's just a bald rationalization gone wild. The religious aren't at all concerned whether any of it is true or not. They're just going with their fifis and are entirely incapable of evaluating any of it from beyond their emotional reactions. These are just people who made stuff up to coddle their own feelings and can't understand why anybody's got a problem with it.
The tool is Bayesian probability. Here's how it works. For any given data D and hypothesis H, we can investigate whether D is evidence for or against H by asking two questions.
Yeah, let me pop in here real quick and point out that he won't be working with any actual data. It will be all faith, no evidence at all. This is what my religion teaches. Well, so what? I don't care what your religion teaches. Just because you believe it, that doesn't mean that it's true. You have to test it first to see if it's valid before you pretend that it means anything. Josh, you need to go back to the drawing board and try again.
Question 1. How likely is D given H? Question 2. How likely is D without H?
Given that you don't have D to begin with, what difference does any of that make? This is where they run into so many issues because they don't understand the difference between their religious assertions and actual objective data. Just because you really want it to be true, that doesn't make it true. You might be able to construct a hypothetical, but it doesn't actually mean anything in the real world. Using the contents of the Harry Potter books as your data, you're never going to prove the existence of Hogwarts, not in any realistic way. It just doesn't work that way, sorry.
In this context, the term likely means reasonable degree of expectation. For example, if I find some cereal on the floor, I can consider how likely or expected that cereal would be on my floor if my cat were recently in the kitchen. In this case, the data D is my discovery of the cereal on the floor. H is the hypothesis that my cat was just in the kitchen.
But the religious, they don't have any demonstrable data. That's the thing. Remember, this is all about trying to demonstrate that evil in the world is fine, given what they think about their gods. A closer analogy would be to find nothing on the floor and wonder if the nothingness was caused by the flying spaghetti monster. Sure, but what the hell difference does it make?
Now, if D is more expected to me given hypothesis H than without H, then D gives me a reason in support of H.
Well, yes and no. If there are other possible explanations for the spilled cereal that are just as likely as the cat, then you haven't really demonstrated anything, just because you presuppose that the cat did it. Remember, that's all that's going on here. It's all just presupposition. The religious are just presupposing their gods are real without ever demonstrating that their gods are real. They can't demonstrate it, they just really want it to be true. Again, a better example here would be to presuppose that, given the spilled cereal, a ghost cat floated through your wall and somehow spilled the cereal and then vanished without a trace. You can't show that it was ever there to begin with or that ghost cats are real. It's all just something you yanked out of your ass because you really liked the idea, but hey, it's the same thing they're doing with their gods, isn't it? And that's not a good way to rationally evaluate claims.
We can apply this tool to data involving evil. Let D be the existence of mysterious evil.
It isn't mysterious, though. It's just the way that the real world works based on the data that we have at hand. Sometimes crap happens. It isn't intended, it's just there. And this all comes down to the desperate desire to understand and attach reasons to things that may not actually have any reasons. It's wanting there to be purpose when purpose simply isn't evident. Now, where have we heard that before? Because it sure sounds like a very religious concept, doesn't it?
And let H be the hypothesis that a perfect being exists.
There's no reason to hypothesize a perfect being at all. Now, you can pose a hypothesis all you want, but that doesn't actually mean anything until you can verify that it's actually so. And it's why hypotheses don't really matter without attempting a rational verification. Now, keep in mind that Josh is only talking to the already faithful here. He's not trying to convince the skeptics, because we'd be asking a whole lot of questions that he has no actual answers for. How likely is X? Not likely at all, given the fact that it seems to be completely made up. Insert perfect, invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies for his perfect being, and see that for yourself. It just doesn't get you anywhere.
The two questions then are these. Question 1, how likely or expected are mysterious evils if a perfect being exists? Question 2, how likely or expected are mysterious evils if a perfect being does not exist?
Exactly the same, because the perfect being is completely nonsensical given our current observations. I get that Josh and people like him really want this indemonstrable perfect being to be real, but you don't always get what you want, do you? Come on back when you have something better to offer. We'll wait, probably forever.
Now, these are not easy questions, and different people will estimate different answers. Your answers will depend on your assessment of what is expected, given all of your experiences.
But we're not talking about experiences here, are we? We're just talking about feelings. Nobody has ever had a demonstrable experience with any god, period. Just because you really want a god to be real, that doesn't actually get you anywhere. He might as well be talking about Mickey Mouse. You can't actually evaluate anything about his claims without a whole lot more information, and the religious, as we all know, are really, really terrible about providing defensible answers. They just want it to be true, but that doesn't get you one step closer to actual truth. Your fifis don't mean anything. It's time to grow up.
But here is one analysis for your consideration. Consider first that a perfect being would include a perfect mind.
How do you know that? I mean, keep in mind that all of this is completely imaginary at this point. It's like saying, well, what about the perfect dragon? Well, what about it? It's not even worth taking seriously as a concept until you can show that it isn't a complete waste of time to even consider the proposition. Now remember, the whole point of the problem of evil, that has nothing at all to do with the actual existence of any gods. That's an evidence problem, not a philosophical one. The issue that it has is with the arbitrary characteristics that the religious have seen fit to just staple onto their imaginary friends. Whether the God actually exists or not is really irrelevant to the problem of evil. It's all the made-up characteristics. They just invented them, and they just attached them without having any means whatsoever to show that they're actually true of the real thing. We're just pointing out that all of this is, by its very nature, self-defeating.
Such a mind would grasp values far beyond what any limited mind could grasp.
And what did I tell you? God has to have a reason. Sure, God has a reason for letting innocent children die of cancer, for letting people get run over by cars through absolutely no fault of their own, for letting innocent animals perish in agony in forest fires started by lightning, etc., etc. That was his example initially, so I might as well make use of it. Well, God has a plan! No, God is a dick. I don't care what God's plan is. I don't care about any gods at all, since they can't be proven to exist. But even if they did, and even if they did have a grand plan, that doesn't mean that humans have to accept it. This is, once again, why he's not talking to us. Because we're not going to take any of this ridiculous bullcrap seriously. His God is a douchebag. Screw his God. And screw anybody who makes excuses for this frickin' moral monster.
For that reason, one may expect, just by logic, that if God were perfect, then probably God would have some reasons that moral agents would not always be able to grasp. That's expected if a perfect mind does exist. Meanwhile, in the absence of a perfect being, expectations differ. Consider that there is no purely logic-based reason to expect particles to ever produce moral persons.
Yet, that's demonstrably what happened. That's what happens when you go with the evidence that we actually have. You find demonstrable truth. Oh, I know that doesn't make the religious feel good, but we have tons of evidence that exactly that happened, and none whatsoever that their God exists. Your happiness doesn't mean the slightest thing. Only what actually happened does, and every shred of evidence that we have points to a completely naturalistic explanation, and not some ridiculous magical spook in the sky. But they don't care about any of that, do they? They just want to believe.
In fact, logic doesn't even require that there be particles at all. Moreover, logic doesn't require reality to unfold in the highly precise way required to allow for the existence of moral communities who can ponder the problems of evil, and who could, if they choose, work together towards solutions.
Yet, here we are. He's just rationalizing his way to his imaginary friend without anything whatsoever to back it up. This is just dishonest dumbassery 101. He says logic doesn't require X. So what? Logic doesn't require anything. Logic is something that we just made up. It seems to work properly applied, which is why the religious tend to go entirely off the rails, because they're not using it rationally. Because, say it with me, they just don't care.
On this analysis, it follows, perhaps surprisingly, that theism makes more likely the existence of a moral framework in which beings encounter events that happen for reasons they do not presently know.
Yeah, and that's some ridiculous bullshit right there. It does nothing of the sort because there's no reason to think that anything that the religious propose is even remotely possible in the real world that we actually live in. This is just pushing your blind faith because it makes you feel good, and the people that you're pushing it on, they're not smart enough to see just how ridiculous you're being. I'd really love to see any of these idiot apologists actually understand the problems that they're pushing, but yeah, they've got zero interest, right? It just might get in the way of their childish fifis, and they can't have that.
To be clear, this analysis is not complete. I have not shown that no event could count as evidence against theism.
You haven't shown any evidence in favor of theism at all. None. None whatsoever, Josh. You have just proposed an explanation invented out of whole cloth based on your feelings because you really wish it was true. Theism isn't even a hypothesis. It's just crap you yanked straight out of your ass because you really like the idea that it might be true. And that's just stupid. Please, Josh, stop being stupid. It's just not becoming.
There are many cases and classes of evil to consider. Rather than attempt to wade through various cases here, I will instead offer a final thought about how to approach probability judgments in general. My proposal is to steer between the extremes of fierce skepticism on the one hand and dogmatic presumption on the other.
Because he can't address actual skepticism in any reasonable way. It's like the religious always ask, have you ever tried being a religious dumbass? Well, yeah, lots of atheists once did. We just got better. But the better question would be, why in the world would you want to be a dumbass to begin with? It's like asking, have you ever tried giving yourself a lobotomy with a dull fork? No, because that's idiotic. Come back with a better suggestion based on logic, reason, and evidence. We'll keep waiting because I don't think it's ever going to come.
The fiercely skeptical person says no one could ever be justified in any estimate of the relevant probabilities. For example, no one could be justified in having any expectations about what a perfect being would likely do or not do in any situation.
And they'd be right. We have absolutely no evidence of any kind that a perfect being is even a remote possibility, much less a reality. Invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies, remember? You can't just propose an idea that you like just because you like it and expect anybody to take you seriously. You have to have a reasonable, rational motivation for proposing something like that in the first place, and your fifis just don't count. Come on back when you've got something better. Of course, they won't because, as usual, they are mistaking if with because. They don't wonder if a God is real. It's always because a God is real, followed by a whole torrent of wishful thinking garbage that satisfies their emotional state. It's really, really sad that we have to explain just how stupid this is. Yet we do. We always do. Geez, that's pathetic.
This skepticism leads to over-skepticism. If you are fiercely skeptical, then you would have no way to know much of anything. You might have been created 5 minutes ago with all your memories implanted for reasons beyond your comprehension.
Sure, it could have happened, but where's the evidence that it actually did? That's why evidence matters. Just because you can make up some ludicrous idea that you pulled right out of your asshole, that doesn't mean anybody ought to take it seriously until it can be objectively demonstrated to at least be reasonable and rational to accept. Of course, the idea of a God, that doesn't meet any of those criteria, does it? Therefore, the religious hate skepticism because we're going to point out all the things that they're doing wrong. Because they're doing an awful lot wrong. And it's just laughable that they're so completely blinded to it.
You couldn't even know that this scenario is unlikely. That's too skeptical. The presumptuous person, by contrast, falls into the other extreme. This person presumes to know that they are in a good position to see what every reason for evil would or could be. Thus, when they don't see a reason, they presume to know that there is therefore probably no reason.
I really find it hysterical that the religious don't even understand why skeptics use the problem of evil in the first place. It's yet more evidence that they don't actually want to talk about any of this with us. They're too busy theologically masturbating in their religious safe spaces because they can't dare go outside or reality might get them, and they certainly can't have that. Every second this goes on, Josh gets dumber and dumber. Is it okay if I find that tremendously sad? Because I do.
Both stances lead to errors, since both stances cannot be justified by the canons of reason. Rather than be too skeptical or too presumptuous, the clearest path to progress on any subject is to stay curious.
But you're not. If you were, you wouldn't go on faith. You'd actually insist on having some evidence like we do. Of course, that's not emotionally comforting, and that's why he's just making videos for Christians instead of trying to convince the rational and skeptical that he's right. Because, like all the rest, he's terrified of us. They all are, and that's just idiotic. So, audience participation time. What do you think about Josh Rasmussen so far? Do you think he's got any good points at all, or are you just rolling your eyes like I am? Let me know in the comments. It just seems to me to be a complete waste of time when it's clear that they are terrified to actually engage with the non-religious because their arguments look absolutely and utterly ridiculous to us. Mostly that's because they are. They try to attack their detractors completely without their detractors' involvement by throwing crap at the wall to see what sticks with the already religious. Truth, as I keep saying, it isn't remotely a factor because they just don't care. And that's really dumb, isn't it? Really dumb indeed. The religious are really, really, really bad at rational arguments, aren't they? If they find an excuse to offer or a bald rationalization to invent, they'll do it in a heartbeat because it's really all about their emotions, not about the objective facts. Reality is far too scary for them to exist in, yet they do, whether they like it or not. So let's see another example of it all going horribly, horribly wrong. Because these pseudo-academics aren't any better than the lunatics in the pews. So stand by for stupidity in 3, 2, 1. Welcome to part 3 of Josh Rasmussen's look at the problem of evil, and as I suspect that we all expect, he's going to get absolutely nowhere useful. In fact, he really hasn't even addressed the actual problem of evil so far at all, has he? Maybe in the fourth part, I have no idea, maybe he'll actually get there. All that he's really doing here is trying to coddle the fifis of the religiously immature, and that's really not impressive to anybody but the theologically delusional. Now, I'm not sure why anyone thinks that this helps the theistic argument, but then again, they don't actually want to talk to us at all, do they? They'd rather hide and tell each other comforting stories and just make stuff up, which is really what's coming up today. So, if that's what you're looking for, enjoy, I guess.
Why is there evil?
Yeah, I know. I let you get in 4 words, but I've got to give you my views before I let you run around with the goalposts. Because, let's be honest, that's exactly what's going to happen. We already know that. The fact is, there isn't evil. At least, there isn't any such thing as objective evil. Evil is just the label that we put on things that we really don't like. Just like good is the label that we put on things that we happen to approve of. It's entirely subjective, and it doesn't matter how many people share that subjective view, it remains subjective regardless. Nothing is inherently evil, and nothing is inherently good. And anybody who thinks that there is, they clearly haven't thought about it critically enough. So let's see what Josh has to say, because I'm willing to bet it's not going to be rationally defensible.
This video is number 3 in a series on how evil might fit into a world with a good foundation. In the previous video, I suggested that it is perhaps unsurprising that at least some things would happen for reasons beyond my sight. But that doesn't answer my heart's deep questions. What are the reasons for evil? Like Job, one may question whether anything could genuinely make sense of the tragedies we see.
And there's the whole problem. He's looking at it as, why does this happen to me? As though there's a reason, when more often than not, it just happens. It just does. There are lots of people out there desperately trying to draw connections between bad stuff that happens and some reason or cause for it to happen to them. And that's not the way it works. Sometimes shit just happens. Deal with it. Why do babies sometimes get born with cancer? Because that's how reality is. There's no reason for it. There's no purpose behind it. There's no cause that somebody thought, I should really make this happen. And that's the kind of thing that Josh is looking for. But that's nonsense. Why do animals get burned up in a forest fire? Because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's it. There is no deeper reason. You have to get over yourself, Josh, and a lot of people have a serious problem doing so. They are allowing their emotional state to get in the way of their capacity to rationally evaluate reality. Don't do that. Grow up and deal with the world as it actually is, regardless of how it makes you feel, because how you feel doesn't actually matter. Come on, it's really not that hard. I promise.
The purpose of this video, like the previous, is not to answer every question. Rather, I will merely offer one more tool you can use in your own further analysis.
In other words, instead of trying to find any actual answers, he's just going to throw out emotionally comforting diatribes meant to appeal to specific groups of religious people because that's how they've been indoctrinated to look at the world. This is why having an intelligent conversation with the religious is often so difficult, because they have all of these really asinine ideas stuffed into their heads that they are completely unwilling to let go of because, fifis. This is why you can't talk about science with creationists or astrophysics with flat earthers. Their beliefs have poisoned their intellect. They are incapable of seeing reality as it actually is anymore. It harms their emotional state, and they refuse to actually learn anything useful that gets in the way of their beliefs. This is why religion is such a mind poison. It demonstrably harms everyone.
The tool is Theodicy. A theodicy is simply an account to some of the reasons a perfect being may have for allowing various evils.
Yet, you haven't shown that there is a perfect being to begin with. Here we see Josh starting with an emotionally comforting conclusion because he really wants it to be true, and he can only consider questions through the lens of his already existing belief structure. This is why, if you talk to a flat earther, they're going to interpret all of the data through the lens of their pre-existing beliefs. This has to be true because they've got an emotional attachment to the things that they already believe. They lack the capacity to step back and evaluate the data fairly and without prejudice because their entire worldview is prejudice incarnate. If you're talking to somebody like Josh, I would imagine anyway, because I don't actually know Josh, I can only go by his videos, but if you were talking to somebody like him, you'd be unlikely to ever get past the preconception that there has to be a God, because God is a fundamental part of their views. It would be like saying up is down and black is white, and they just couldn't handle that. And that's why they have such a problem changing their minds. Because in reality, they're not using them in the first place.
To develop a theodicy, we can consider from both reason and experience how bad things depend on or lead to greater goods.
But they don't. Just as there is no objective bad, there's no objective good either. And this is where bald rationalization enters into the fray. They have constructed this view of the world in their heads that isn't actually accurate. But because it makes them feel good, it becomes part and parcel with their own self-identity, to the point that trying to push through it would result in the complete collapse of their psyche, so they never do that. These people simply do not live in the real world anymore. They start with the belief that there is a God, whether they can demonstrate it or not, and we all know they can't, and that becomes the cornerstone of everything else in their head. Whether or not it's true, They don't care. It's entirely irrelevant. This doesn't matter. It exists beyond their capacity to consider the rational ramifications of their beliefs. And this is why these people are such a complete mess.
Theodicies are not designed to answer all our questions, but they might help put some of our questions into a larger perspective.
No, they don't answer any questions at all, at least not demonstrably. They start with the emotionally comforting assumptions that the religion that they have, the religion they were raised in, the religion they've been brainwashed in believing, that is absolutely true, and then they build from there. They can't backtrack to see if any of it makes any sense whatsoever. Well, this is how God could be. But you don't have a demonstrable God first, do you? You can't just believe it because you want to believe it, and that's really all they do, isn't it? It's exactly why childhood indoctrination is so devastatingly insidious. It really messes people up.
To illustrate just one theodicy, I will sketch a theory that is inspired by my own reflections on the elements of a great story. I call it the love story theodicy. In near-death experiences, various people have reported meeting a being of light upon cardiac arrest.
Yes, they have reported that. That's not actually what's going on, though. We know the actual medical reasons behind it, and for the most part, we can replicate it all in the lab. What's happening is electrochemical, not supernatural. And I'm sure that people like Josh here really want to believe that it's true because it fits in with the religious beliefs that they already have. They only want to validate what's already in their heads. They don't actually care what's really going on. They don't want to accept what the best supported and independently verified explanation is because that's not emotionally comforting. It's another reason why it's so hard to talk to these people, because they'd rather believe a comforting lie than to have to face a potentially uncomfortable truth. The truth is the truth, no matter how it makes you feel, but for them, fee-fees are all. And that's really pretty stupid.
In some cases, they report asking the being of light questions, including questions about evil and suffering. I have heard many such cases, and in all the cases of which I'm aware, there is a core common theme. They feel a sense that this life is part of a far greater story, and that love is central to their purposes.
Based on the mythology that they've had drummed into their heads from a very early age. Here's the reality, though. You don't see people from, say, Western cultures seeing Eastern deities during NDEs. You also don't see the reverse. It's always the things that you're the most familiar with showing up when your brain is on the verge of catastrophic shutdown. Why? Because this isn't really happening. It's all brain chemistry and trauma. It's something the religious don't want to listen to, though, because it says something distinctly unpleasant about the ideas that they use to dictate their lives. Well, too bad, because this is the reality, and you don't just get to pick and choose.
Now, whether or not you believe any of these reports, my observation here is just that this theme of love and greater story interweaves the world's great spiritual traditions, and it enters into many of the classic theodicies.
Because people want comfort. That doesn't mean that's really what's going on, though. It's why the brain releases DMT during high stress periods, such as close to death. And you know what DMT does? It causes hallucinations. Like I said, it's all brain chemistry, and these people, they aren't remotely interested in the facts. They just want to feel good.
The love story theodicy connects love and greater purpose to the following question. What are the elements of a great story? Here are some elements that I see. Exploration, tensions and releases, comic relief, courage in the face of uncertainty, layers of truth, layers of discovery, challenge, progress, a variety of dynamic characters, diversity of relationships, episodes that contribute to a larger plot, romance, hints of the future, trials, sacrifice, cleverness, real dangers, elements of horror, redemption, victory, interwoven stories that build together towards something great, consistent rules that cannot be broken willy-nilly, unpredictable surprises, long-term projects, and heroic displays of love.
You do notice that he just contradicted himself, right? How do you get consistent rules and unpredictable surprises? Yeah, okay, whatever, Josh. What he's talking about here isn't reality, though. It's just storytelling. It's myth-making. It's exactly the kind of thing that went into the Bible and every religious tradition that mankind has ever invented for himself to follow. It's fine that you understand what goes into a decent story, but that doesn't mean that's how reality actually works. You did notice that, though, right? He's using the same tools to evaluate mythology as he is to evaluate his perception of reality. That's kind of sad, isn't it?
A truly great story would involve a great sacrifice of love by the greatest being in that story, and it would involve layers of mystery to be uncovered. There would be tragedy, yet all tragedies for all souls would be transformable into something beautiful and perhaps unexpected in later scenes.
He's describing the Bible, which is just a book of mythology, and I don't think he realizes what he's doing, because none of them ever do. The reason it reads like a book of fiction is because it is a book of fiction. It's just something that got made up over time. It isn't real, but the second anyone brought that up to Josh, he just rejected out of hand because he doesn't like that. That idea doesn't make him happy. Well, too bad for you. Unfortunately for people like Josh, happiness doesn't really mean anything. The ideas that are actually relevant are the ideas that actually hold up in objective reality. Sure, you might want to be happy, but that doesn't mean that your happiness colors the way that the world actually works. This is stupid. It really, really is. But this is the way the religious operate.
Interestingly, the love story theodicy is consistent with the canons of both logic and human history. The love story theodicy can also provide a basis for hope to anyone enduring a trial in their own story.
Except hope doesn't matter, does it? Sure, you might want hope, but in reality, shit just happens. You're just trying to tell yourself comforting tales in your head so you don't have to feel so bad when things happen to go south. Well, too bad for you. Whether you're happy when the avalanche squishes you into a pulp or not, that's still your fate. Your happiness doesn't actually change anything. There is no reason to take any of this seriously because ultimately, you're just a big bag of water and chemicals and a 3-pound sack of meat in your head. What happens, happens. Your feelings, while they might feel good to you, they don't actually impact anything on the outside.
Also, something like the love story theodicy is not unexpected if the foundation is indeed good, since a good foundation would value a good, true story. Now, whether the love story is a framework for a true story, or merely a fantasy ultimately produced by the mindless motions of matter, is a question for each person in the story to consider.
No, it's not. This is something else that you'll find with the religious. There is no my truth or your truth. There is only the truth. If you're seeking out the truth, then you're probably not going to fall for any of this emotionally comforting religious bunk. Your feelings don't matter to anybody but you. They don't have any impact on objective reality around you, whether you like that or not. And that's why the religious don't want to talk to us, because we're going to point out everywhere that they're going wrong. And they're going wrong in an awful lot of places. But they don't want to hear that, do they? So they'd rather just, run away and hide. And that brings us back to the very beginning of the video, where Josh asked a very simple question. Why is there evil? And he never even tried to answer that, did he? It's because the religious just don't have an answer. They just have assertions pulled out of their backsides because it makes them happy. They are desperately trying to rationalize their way back to emotional comfort. They don't actually want real answers, because real answers, they aren't comforting. It's far easier to just wave your arms around and accept a comforting lie than to actually strive for objective truth, whether it makes you happy or not. Your happiness doesn't really matter at all. It doesn't mean a thing. It doesn't get you to the facts. It only gets you to chemical ecstasy, and no matter how good that might feel in the moment, it's ultimately hollow. Yet the religious, they don't really care about any of that, do they? It's why it's so pointless engaging with them most of the time, because they are incapable of stepping away from their childish emotional state and just dealing with things the way that they actually are. Because they're terrified of how things actually are. And that's really, really sad, isn't it? Can the religious actually answer questions in any credible, evidence-based way? Well, yeah, of course not. What a silly question that is. Yet, we're going to let Josh Rasmussen give it a shot one more time, even though he's destined to fail. Why? Because he's not at all concerned with the real world, of course. What the hell else is new? We're back today for the last installment of Josh Rasmussen's 4-part video series on the problem of evil, even though he never really addresses the problem of evil. Okay, fine, whatever. Yet, he never really makes any decent points either, as I think this final video will show. It's just, what if? Followed by a whole bunch of religiously confirming conclusions that don't stand up to any kind of critical scrutiny whatsoever. Because, who cares about that, right? Certainly not the religious. So, let's get this over with.
What sort of world could contain evil?
The real one? Now, keep in mind, evil exists only because intelligent minds exist. Evil has no objective existence at all outside of our heads. We only see it that way because we came up with the concept ourselves. Ultimately, evil is just the things that we really don't like compared to things that we'd prefer. What one person considers evil, other people might think are just fine. It's all purely subjective. But that's not something that the religious tend to favor, is it?
In this video, I will show how evil may actually be evidence of a world with a good foundation. To begin, imagine you have some dirt in your hand. Here's a challenge. Try to make this dirt evil. How might you do that?
I don't know. I mean, maybe if you threw it off an overpass onto cars passing below until they'd all crash and burn and everybody would die because they couldn't see. Granted, most people would think that would be you that was evil since you did all the work. But what about a storm? If a storm blew up a bunch of dirt and dust and things like that, and the same thing happened, would anybody say that the storm was evil? Probably not. Like I said, this is all entirely subjective. Evil doesn't actually exist in the real world. You need to get that through your head.
How could you convert dirt into something evil? You could smash the dirt, spread it out, compact it, but none of these actions would make the dirt evil. To understand how to make evil, we must understand what evil is. What is evil?
Well, if you want to go with, say, a dictionary definition, it's profound immorality and wickedness, especially when regarded as a supernatural force. And that makes God evil if you look at a lot of the things that the Bible claims that he did. However, none of that even exists in reality, so I'm not really seeing the point here. It's all just subjective, as I said. If we really don't like something, we simply declare it evil. And that's certainly not consistent because different people declare different things to be evil. What some people consider evil, others will consider good, and others will consider entirely neutral. It doesn't matter, it's all subjective. So I'm really not sure what point Josh is trying to get to, but let's let him try to explain it, shall we?
Here's a hypothesis. Evil is a departure from the way things ought to be. For example, genocide is evil because people ought to be safe.
And exactly what asshole did you pull that one out of? Your wishes don't accurately describe reality. People don't deserve anything. There is no ought here at all. There is only reality, and your feelings don't remotely enter into it. Because this is really where things tend to go sideways with the religious. They only care about their feelings. They can't see anything except through that particular lens. And whether they like it or not, that lens is stupid. Sorry to say that to you people, but it is. When people fall off a boat and drown, that's not evil. That's physics. Crap happens. We may not like it, but who the hell says we get to dictate reality based on our fee-fees? All right, the religious do that. Well, sorry, but that's just stupid.
Notice that the way things ought to be is not always the same as the way things are. For example, if your bones are broken, that's how they are, not how they ought to be.
Except you're just asserting that difference. You can't actually demonstrate it. What you're really saying here, Josh, is that things aren't the way that you want them to be. Not ought, want. There's a difference. But the religious can't seem to figure that out, can they? They value their desires over their grasp on the real world, and that's kind of a problem, isn't it? Not that you'll ever get them to admit it or anything, but it remains a problem nonetheless.
This observation supports our hypothesis. Evil occurs when the way things are departs from the way they ought to be. On this account, to make evil out of dirt, there must first be a way things ought to be. Let us call the way things ought to be the moral standard.
Sure, as long as you're just making stuff up, why not? Because this is the religious, telling themselves stories because fee-fees. Is it any wonder that the skeptical and rational don't take any of this crap seriously? This is just the religious defining their happiness into reality by explaining how they really wish the world would be, slapping a label on it and just calling it good, and anything that violates that imaginary natural order, well, that just becomes evil. But like I said before, that's just stupid, isn't it? Well, yes. Yes, it is.
To make evil, then, we need a moral standard. But how do we get a moral standard? Can we make a moral standard out of dirt?
No, but we can't just make one up either, which is exactly what people have been doing since day one. Now, Josh, he's not going to like that. He's going to insist that his imaginary friend is necessary because that's what Josh wants to believe. But Josh isn't remotely concerned with what actually happens in the real world, is he? Again, he only cares about his fee-fees and never ever about the actual facts. And this is why they start with a belief in a god, and then they just backfill in all of the bald rationalizations that they need to make it seem like it fits, even though it really doesn't. Every other religion is doing the exact same thing, just with different gods and different rationalizations, but it all ultimately leads to the exact same place. Futility. Utter futility and complete fantasy. But, as we all know, they're really not that concerned, are they?
Here are 3 reasons to think not. First, arrangements of dirt are arrangements of the way things are, or could be, which is not the same as a standard for how things ought to be.
What makes you think there is an ought? This brings us right back to David Hume's is-ought problem, where Hume recognizes that the religious propose that there ought to be an ought rather than a recognition of what actually is. The religious are looking for a preferred state of affairs, but that doesn't mean that there is one. No matter how much you might really want things to be a certain way, that doesn't actually mean anything. Things are what they are. Your demand that they should be something else is completely meaningless. Yet the religious persist out of emotional comfort, not out of a recognition of the actual facts. Because to them, the facts just don't mean anything.
Second, producing a moral standard from dirt seems to be a category mistake, like producing prime numbers from prime ministers. The creation of a moral standard requires a categorical shift from non-moral to moral.
Well, you're the one that brought up dirt in the first place, remember? If you have a problem with the idea, blame yourself. Now, this assumes that there's any such thing as moral beyond the human mind in the first place, something that no theist has ever demonstrated, and as far as I can tell, it simply isn't demonstrable. Nobody is saying that you can get a moral standard from dirt but you, and that sounds distinctly like a Josh problem to me.
And it is not clear how any mere change in arrangement of dirt could account for such a categorical shift. Third, the moral standard seems to hold of necessity. For example, it seems to be a necessary truth that slaughtering innocent people is a departure from the way things ought to be.
Says who? Because that's exactly how things have worked throughout history, whether you like it or not. But that's really what all of this happens to be about. Josh's feelings. It doesn't appeal to him on an emotional level, and therefore, well, it just can't possibly be true. Yeah, except it is. I don't care what you like. It is. We're just not special. We're just animals. Killing each other is kind of what we do, and what we will always do on some level. It doesn't matter what veneer of civility you drape over humanity. We will always find excuses to kill each other if we can justify it. And keep in mind, those justifications, they're purely subjective too, just like morality. But that doesn't make me happy. Well, too bad. Welcome to the real world. Stick around and try to learn something. It really isn't that hard.
Configurations of dirt, by contrast, are merely contingent. No dirt holds its place of necessity. But if we can't use dirts to produce a moral standard, then what can we use? Marbles? Cheese? Protons? Maybe we could use brain states.
Which is the actual answer, but I think we all know he'll reject it in a second because he's got something else in mind. You know, that emotionally comforting belief that he holds to for absolutely no good, valid, or evidentially supported reason. I keep saying this, but I think it's important to note that once you're aware of how the religious think in air quotes of course, it's really hard not to see the irrational thought patterns that go into their blind faith. They don't believe because they have a good reason. They believe because they want to. And Josh here, he is absolutely no different. He is the unfortunate low-hanging fruit that I'm really trying to get away from. I want people who can come to religious conclusions without relying on their childish fifis. Why is it that I can't find any of those? Can anybody out there please explain? I'd really like to know.
Unfortunately, all contingent materials, whatever their ingredients, have the same deficiency. None are a necessary standard of the way things ought to be.
You mean that thing that you're just asserting but can't actually prove exists? Yeah, that thing. Because this is where the religious completely fall apart. They are looking for perfection in a universe that is inherently imperfect, at least from their point of view. There's no such thing as perfect. Perfect is a concept. It isn't a part of reality. They really want to feel special, even though they're not. They want to be loved unconditionally, even though that's really an absurd thing to desire. They want to be protected in an uncaring world that doesn't give a damn whether they live or die, nor even has the capacity to do so. The religious are just immature little children who don't comprehend the reality that surrounds them. And that makes them invent things out of whole cloth because it makes them happy. And that's just dumb. There is something really, really wrong with these people upstairs. We can all see it. Why the hell can't they?
The moral standard, if there is such a thing, must already exist prior to all contingent things.
Now, just a quick note here, because he says, if one exists, and then immediately assumes that one does without demonstrating it in any way, shape, or form. This is the classic misunderstanding of the difference between if and because. Even the supposedly educated fall for it. Sad, isn't it?
Otherwise, departures from the way things ought to be could never come to exist anywhere. These observations inspire the following argument for a perfectly good foundation. Premise 1. Evil exists.
Wrong. Now, we do think that evil exists, we just arbitrarily label things that we don't like as evil. There just isn't an objective demonstration of evil. You just lost, Josh. This really isn't that hard.
Premise 2. If evil exists, then it is possible for evil to exist. Therefore, it is possible for evil to exist.
Which is a completely nonsensical statement. If evil exists, which it doesn't, at least in the objective sense, but for the sake of argument, we'll go with it. But if evil exists, then evil exists. There is no possibly involved. This is just basic logic. A equals A. If you're alive, you're not possibly alive, you're alive. That's just the way that it works, Josh.
Premise 3. If the foundation of all things is perfectly good, then its perfect goodness provides a moral standard without which evil would be impossible.
There's that if again. You haven't actually shown that there is a foundation. You're just leaping to that conclusion without any demonstration whatsoever. You just really want it to be true, but that doesn't mean that it is true. And this is the fundamental failure in all theology. Your wishes and your dreams don't matter when it comes to objective reality. Your ifs don't become becauses simply because you wish that they did. He's just smuggling in all of his theology without verifying that his theology actually means anything. Josh is just compounding his failures. What the hell else is new?
Premise 4. If there is not a perfectly good foundation, then there is no guarantee of any moral standard that would make evil possible.
That's probably about as close as he's gotten to making sense so far, sadly. There's really no evidence for any foundation, period, beyond human desire. Evil is a purely subjective idea. There are no objective moral standards, period, because there are no objective morals. It's just a load of wishful thinking and emotional desires. Of course, he'll reject this out of hand because he just doesn't want it to be true. But so what? It doesn't matter what you want. What you want doesn't mean anything. Reality is what reality is, whether that makes you happy or not. Josh, get the hell over yourself.
Conclusion. The possibility of evil supports, that is, makes more probable, the perfect foundation theory.
It does absolutely nothing of the sort. Every single premise, with possibly one exception, was completely faulty. This is what happens when you let the religious fast-talking run around with the goalposts. It's also why they're not out there talking to the skeptics. All of Josh's videos are made for people who already accept his base assumptions. He can't possibly demonstrate any of them, so he just talks to people who already think that they're true. And this is how to get absolutely nowhere in any kind of rational discussion. You don't have any rational discussions. You just preach to the choir, which is really all that Josh is doing here.
This follows from premises 3 and 4, together with the Bayesian analysis of conditional expectations. This argument has several interesting features. First, it is compatible with a wide range of secular moral theories, including contractarianism, moral Platonism, consequentialism, and various constructivisms. All these theories include a moral standard, and a good foundation would contain that standard within its nature.
Yeah, except it doesn't. Josh is trying to get to a God without mentioning a God, let's be honest. And all secular moral theories accept that humans are the moral standard bearer, not some imaginary man in the sky. Most secular moral theories begin with picking a subjective standard and then trying to apply objectivity to that standard moving forward. I don't think that works very well, but this really isn't the place to go into it. So, no, Josh, I don't buy it, sorry. Every premise you have is terminally flawed. Go back to the drawing board and come back with something better.
Second, the argument has modest premises. I did not say that evil is guaranteed to be impossible without a perfectly good foundation. Rather, the argument is that a perfectly good foundation guarantees a moral framework, while its negation does not. That's enough to get support for the theory.
No, absolutely none of that is true. The whole thing really falls apart at the first premise, something that I reject entirely in the sense that he intends it, and it continues to crumble as he goes on. I think he foresees people having issues with his formulation, and he's just trying to shore it up, but there's really nothing of substance there worth looking at in the first place. This is true of just about everything the religious do. It's true of all of their ideas. They're based on an emotionally comforting conclusion that they've already come to because it satisfies their feelings, then trying to backfill in ideas that seem to support that conclusion without being independently defensible on their own. And this just doesn't work, Josh. I don't care what you feel.
Third, the argument gives us a bonus result. The perfect foundation theory not only predicts the possibility of evil, but it also predicts the likely existence of moral agents who can apprehend a moral standard. That's because a perfectly good foundation would have powers and purposes, and could thus cause reality to evolve in precisely the right ways required for the emergence of morally valuable communities.
And he keeps on smuggling in his theology, if you notice. Being a morally perfect being, if such a thing existed, would not necessarily have any powers or purposes whatsoever. This is just saying God without saying God. And that's what he's talking about here, because that's what his intended audience expects him to be talking about. The idea that we can't see that loud and clear is really absurd. We can see it, Josh. It's very obvious. You don't have to play make-believe. But this isn't just a Josh problem. This happens beyond the religious scope. I mean, just look at New Age idiots and essential oil scams. They'll speak in what is effectively code so that it doesn't sound quite so ridiculous to outsiders, but to all the gullible bobbleheads in the audience, they're all going, because they know what it's supposed to mean. I don't know if people like Josh are just too stupid and they just don't know that the skeptics are going to see right through all of it or what, but this isn't impressing anybody.
A merely abstract, uninstantiated form of the good, by contrast, lacks this additional predictive power.
There is no predictive power except in your head. You've got a goal in mind, a goal that can't be demonstrated to be reasonable or rational to begin with. It just makes you feel good to think that any of this is true, and that's not a good reason to think that any of this is true. Because, Josh, here's something that you need to understand. Truth is all that really matters. Your feelings are completely meaningless. I'm looking at what is actually so in the real world that we all share to the best of our ability to determine it, and none of this is getting you anywhere fast. And, yeah, that describes religion to a T, doesn't it?
Fourth and finally, the argument can put the trials in your life into a larger context. If you have reason to think the foundation of all things is good, then you may also have reason to think that the same foundation aims to make things, including bad things, work together for good.
And why in the world would you think that? Well, because it coddles your childish fifis, of course. Really, Josh, listen to yourself and realize just how dumb this all is. But I really want it to be true. Big deal. That is not how reality works. But I really want to fly like Superman. Yeah, who cares? You're not going to because that's stupid. Deal with it. Part of becoming an adult is learning to deal with the world as it actually is, not as you desperately might wish that it could be. It's coming to grips with reality. It's not living in the fantasy world in your head. Why don't you give that a shot, Josh? It can only help. This is really the problem that I have with the religious, and I think they've been doing it for so long that they're completely blinded to it. They just don't care anymore if they ever did. It's all about their fifis and never, ever about the facts. But in the real world, the facts are actually important, and your feelings simply aren't. Josh never really attempted to address the problem of evil in any of these videos. He just went, well, what if? And then assumed that his what if was what was actually going on. If that's supposed to impress anybody, it certainly didn't impress me, and I hope it didn't impress you either. He's just another one of the ridiculously low-hanging fruit who hasn't actually come to any rational conclusions, because rational conclusions, they aren't emotionally comforting, are they? He just wants it to be true, and he's aiming his videos at other people who also want it to be true, because why the hell not? It's easy that way. You don't actually have to do anything. Yet that's a really stupid reason to actually believe anything, right? The only reason to take a positive position on any claim is when sufficient rational, credible, and demonstrable evidence has been presented, and not 1 second before. And that doesn't seem to matter much to the religious or any of the other gullible fools out there because, as I keep saying, they just don't care. So long as it strokes their egos and gives them the dopamine shot to the head that they're looking for, they'll go with it because childish fifis. Seriously, can't we stop doing that? It's time for the planet to grow the hell up and deal with the reality that exists. Because we've had plenty of the other kind and it hasn't worked out so well. So, reality. Try it. It's not that hard. Stop being a dumbass.